This part of the series of lectures and notes under the Jean Monnet EU in LAC project will look specifically at relations between the European Union and Latin America's biggest democracy, Brazil. Biggest not only in territorial size but also in population and GDP, and therefore a country that has in the literature often been analyzed as one which has at times functioned as a driver or enabler or a veto point for the European Union's engagement with the region more widely. What the series of slides does is it looks at the relationship between the European Union and Brazil since its establishment, since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the European economic communities at the time and Brazil in 1960, all the way through to the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, which ended in 2022 with the re-election of President Luiz Inácio da Silva, known as Lula. The series of notes looks at both the evolution of domestic developments and orientations in the EU and Brazil, but also at the geopolitical environment that marked various variables that impacted both the EU's foreign policy, but also Brazil's foreign policy and engagement with the world, and attempts to understand the evolution of the bilateral relationship through these various factors. A first part of the series, therefore, looks at the evolution historically through three distinct periods. The first period marked by relative indifference of the European Union, then European Economic Communities for Brazil, lasting up to approximately 1995. A second period then marked by an increased emphasis on interregionalism in EU foreign policy, therefore a period where the EU engages significantly with the idea of Mercosur, the common market of the South, being its key interlocutor in South America. This period is marked by the establishment of an EU-Mercosur interregional cooperation framework agreement, but also by the launch of negotiations for an association agreement between the European Union and Mercosur. This period ends around 2004 when the negotiations for an association agreement reach a dead end, and that is shortly followed by the initiation of a third period marked by increased bilateralism, culminating in the establishment of a strategic partnership between the EU and Brazil in 2007. From then on, EU-Brazil relations follow the paradigm established under the strategic partnership with bilateral summits that last up to 2014. And as of 2014, as the slides show, a number of external and internal variables in both the EU and Brazil lead to a new complex period, which is a navigation of bilateralism and interregionalism on behalf of the EU, with the final conclusion of the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, both the political and trade pillar in 2019 and 2020 respectively, but with a number of challenges, including emanating from Brazil, facing the ratification of that agreement. While defining these historical periods, the slides will also look into the various domestic factors that affected both the EU's approach to the world, but also Brazil's approach to the world throughout this period, including elements such as the EU's upgrading as a foreign policy actor during the 2000s with the establishment of the External Action Service and the new role assigned to the EU by the Lisbon Treaty, but also the foreign policy approach of successive Brazilian governments, ranging from the activism of the first and second Lula presidencies to the pro-nationalist anti-globalizer approach of Jair Bolsonaro in the late 2020s. It will look at how presidents affected external policy and therefore impacted EU-Brazil relations, but also how within the EU domestic crisis externalized themselves as foreign policy approaches that at times upgraded and at times led to relative indifference towards the EU-Brazil relationship. It will conclude with an outlook for the future at a time when EU-Brazil relations are at an interesting point, with a new president elected in Brazil, with the EU-Mercosur association agreement very much on the table, as geoeconomics require and lead the EU to looking for new, reliable partners in a world that is faced by war on the borders of Europe, but also critical issues to do with supply chains, trade, and technology.